It is my pleasure to introduce today at the French Institute Professor John Darnell from Yale University, who will give us a lecture entitled The Early Hieroglyphic Inscription of the El Kab Desert Hinterland. I think everybody already knows John Darnell, at least from his impressive work and bibliography. He has published documents concerning all the periods of the Egyptian history, from the pre-dynastic to the Coptic period. One can quote, amongst others, the 2 volumes of the Theban Desert Road Survey he already published, and more recently, 2 monographies. The first one, Egypt and the Desert, 2021, and the last one, Egypt Golden Couple, 2022, about Akhenaten and Nefertiti in collaboration with Colin Darnell. And I have personally the feeling that the couple of authors emerging in some points with the Armenian royal couple. But John Darnell's true passion is clearly rock inscriptions, and logically also the Egyptian deserts where they are most often discovered. He devoted several books to them, publishing major documents each time. It was also rock inscriptions that first drew him to the earliest period of the pharaonic culture many years ago. Along with Maria Gatto and our late colleague and friend Stan Hendricks, he was one of the discoverers of the impressive set of rock art scenes at Nag el Abdulab that can probably be dated to the Dynasty 0. In the El Kab region, where he has been working for over 10 years, he also made a breathtaking, amazing discovery, petroglyphs that takes us back to the invention of the hieroglyphic system of writing, and that for the first time provide a parallel to the sequences discovered in the tomb of the so-called Scorpio King, owner of the tomb Yuji in Abydos, that was excavated in the 1980 by the German Institute in Cairo under the direction of Gunther Dreyer. But I won't say anymore, and I am delighted to give him the floor for this lecture, which he has generously agreed to give at the French Institute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pierre, for that undeservedly wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming out this evening to listen to me talk more and more about little scratches on the rock, with which I've become quite obsessed over the years. So I hope you will excuse me if I seem insanely enthusiastic now and then, and you are left wondering exactly what it is I'm seeing in those little scratches, but I hope to explain at least what I think I see in those scratches today. I want to begin by pointing out one interesting feature of rock art and rock art sites, and that is that they engage with people across different regions traveling past that site, and they engage with people across time. They bridge space and time, and visitors, perhaps the same day, later in the day, perhaps centuries later, might augment and add to, even adjust and update inscriptions. So here at the so-called green site in the Wadi Halal, you will see a Naqada II period boat that had at a later period within apparently the Naqada II tradition, a little crew added, and then subsequently, after the patina had darkened it enough, during the Naqada III period, Dynasty 0, an animal-headed boat was carved over it. So an updating of images, a replacement of images, allows us to some extent to step back from pharaonic imagery and from pharaonic traditions back into the mystier realms of the proto-dynastic and the pre-dynastic period. So what I will describe today will rely on parallelism across space and time to try to make sense of what we see at these rock art sites and to see how early hieroglyphic inscriptions fit into this. One of the last things we expected to find in the El Kab rock art area were early hieroglyphic inscriptions, and we now have found, in fact, several of these. And those are the principal subject of what I'll be discussing today. This is the major area in which we're working, the eastern desert hinterland of El Kab in Upper Egypt. And one of the basic features we see of the rock art sites here is that we go from images that seem to describe power, perhaps elite or ruling power, you might call it, to scenes of a royal or proto-royal ritual power, ultimately leading to early hieroglyphic inscriptions. In the desert hinterland of El Kab, a number of sites have boat imagery, frequently in flotillas of vessels. Some of these conceived and executed all at once, others that have grown up over time, some, in fact, with earlier flotillas replaced over time by later. One of the sites I want to look at now is the Sheikh Othman site. That you will see right here, the SU1. There it is, and on this large face against which the scaffolding is built here is a tableau of boats and later images and texts. What's interesting about this is that these boats were not made all at the same time. They were made in different phases, and in each phase we have multiple vessels. In each phase we have flotillas carved. Now, I must say from the outset, I may run out of time, and I apologize for that. Someone will need to come and get me off the stage to stop me when it is time. Please do. Much of what I'm saying today, I'm not saying came simply from myself. I've worked with a number of colleagues, Dorian van Hule, Axel Bremont, the work of others, the work of Pierre Tallet, Stan Hendricks, Dirk Huygens, and it is to Dirk I owe my involvement with the El Kab material, and of course the indulgence of Stan Hendricks and Walter Klaes that we are able to do this. So we have multiple periods of flotillas of boats carved from the late Naqada II period, early Naqada III, Naqada III AB, ultimately ending up with boats and a Serech of Ka'a, last ruler of the first dynasty. So we have a series of updatings of images here, ending with this Serech of Ka'a. These boats appear to represent ritual vessels, so that we have, in other words, images of ritual activity, of ritual authority that finally is replaced by essentially a statement of Ka'a as chief ritualist, as we might expect for the Pharaonic period. Now, there are other places where early dynastic textual material can bear on the pre-dynastic rock art and tell us something about what, at least what the first dynasty Egyptians believed to be the intention of that pre-dynastic art, whether or not, of course, it was the intention of those pre-dynastic rock artists. So here at a site in the Western Desert, west of modern Kamula and Naqada, we have an area with a large number of boat graffiti. This is one of the most remarkable and largest very similar style boats with fronds coming off the cabin. Also, at the site, there are some more images of the same. These appear to be of Naqada 1C to 2D date, virtually all of the boats. They were not made at once. They were made in groups, sometimes as individual vessels at the site over a period of time. Small flotillas grouping together with individual vessels and other flotillas to make this great, massive nautical tableau. At the end of Dynasty 0, if we can date all three by the Serech of Ka'a, who also appears here, actual annotations, early hieroglyphic annotations of First Dynasty date were added to later depictions of boats. And although the interpretation of the inscriptions is still subject to some debate and work, these appear to reference some sort of ritual navigations. And in spite of what the texts say, which doesn't help us that much except referencing the so-called Ma'ati bark that later has associations with the king and Sokar, we actually get depictions of perhaps the ritualist, perhaps the ruler or someone else, actually navigating a vessel in which is a small Ma'ati bark. So whatever that pre-dynastic art was meant to represent in the First Dynasty here, as at Sheikh Othman, it seems to be interpreted as imagery of ritual processions, of royal ritual power. And of course, at Nag el-Hamdulab, just northwest of modern Aswan, in the great cycle of scenes that Maria Gatto rediscovered, we have this annotation, possibly added slightly later than some of the images. There is a question, of course, as to the date of all the individual elements and how they hang together. Nevertheless, it is one great tableau spread out in a bay of the desert. We have an early hieroglyphic inscription that appears to reference perhaps the following of Horus and taxation of some place called Leopard Town. And in fact, we have a number of newly discovered panels of the group that actually depict leopards. One, in fact, in which a hunter, accompanied by hunting leopards rather than hunting dogs, is chasing down an enemy who is being bitten in the rump by one of the hunting leopards. So leopards are rather well associated with this area. So ritual flotillas appear very commonly in the pre-dynastic rock art. They surround the region of El Kab, in fact, and we have some reason to believe that an understanding of them as ritual processions, as elite festival imagery, is justified based on this First Dynasty material. Now, at the northern and southern edges of all of the great routes that lead into the eastern desert through the Wadi Halal and the Wadi Mahamid to the north, bounding the edges where the roads coming off the north-south track paralleling the Nile head in and out of the eastern desert, we have, in fact, serechs of that man who was strangely interested in desert routes and desert regions, Ka, last ruler of the First Dynasty. Now, as we saw at Sheikh Othman, he gives us evidence that at least during his period, at least during his reign, these boats are being interpreted as representations of festival processions. At the Burj al Hammam, the serech is actually accompanied by a little hieroglyphic annotation and looks very similar, in fact, to what you might find on a ceiling. And I believe we might say that what Ha'a is doing here is, rather than ringing El Kab now with these images of ritual power, of royal ritual power, of pre-royal ritual power in processions, he's literally putting his stamp, putting his khatam on the desert. In the inscription of Chaudi at Jebel Chaudi, close to the middle of the desert filling the Kenna Bend, the ruler of the Coptite nome there actually says that the ruler of another district, almost certainly his foe in the Theban nome, has annexed, he uses the term literally, khatam, has annexed the desert. So Ka appears at least to be annexing, expressing his control of desert regions in his serechs, and they parallel to some extent this surrounding of the region of the Wadi Halal and the Wadi Mahamid by earlier pre-dynastic boat imagery. We also get pachyderms. We also get elephant images that ring surround the El Kab region. And in fact, two of these are rather close. El Fawi and Jebel al-Wuz are rather close to where we find those Ka'a Serechs. And in fact, those elephants seem to get updated as well. El Khawi has one good large tableau of Naqada 1 elephants. That's only a portion of the tableau, and it's about as wide as 1.5 of these screens. It's really quite massive on the Jebel. At Jebel al-Wuz, a Naqada 1 set of elephants appears to have been updated by Naqada 2 elephants, and then probably somewhat later by the somewhat less successful, more stick figure-like elephant, perhaps Dynasty 0 or even later. So these elephant images appear to provide boundaries for the region into which these east-west roads travel through the Wadi Mahamid and through the Wadi Halal. So looking at First Dynasty evidence, it looks as though this ringing of El Kab by boats, even by elephants, represents expressions of zoomorphic images of power, animals as conveyors of the concept of a royal or pre-royal power, and boats, processional boats in flotillas, representing the ritual activities and ritual authority of a ruler, proto-ruler, a chief ritualist. Now, unexpectedly, this area is actually peppered as well with early hieroglyphic texts. These are represented in the orange color here, and you can see the boat tableau in blue. You'll notice the Wadi Tanedba in the upper right of the screen shows imagery of Naqada 1, 2, and 3 style in the rock art, but it has no early hieroglyphic inscription there. So the extent of the early hieroglyphic inscriptions is a little bit different, and their locations are slightly different. And here they are. So let me go through a number of these with you, and I will stop periodically. I will pepper my discussion with various sorts of speculation as to what these may mean. Some of this will seem rather out of order. It is. And I apologize for that. It is necessitated by trying to take them in a linear way. So at the Sebaiya site, where we have a number of vessels of Naqada 2 period style and date, we have a bull with a mace in front. Now, this introduces two things that we're going to see in the early hieroglyphic inscriptions that we have in the Eastern Desert and in the Western Desert, which I will mention at least briefly if I don't run out of time, is that animal images and weaponry are actually rather common. However we may read these, if in fact they are readable in that sense, they stress insistently and incessantly royal power through animal imagery and weaponry. Let me rephrase that. Perhaps not royal power, but the power of some nascent state, or at least the power of the literate, or we might call them proto-literate bureaucrats. Now, this pairing of the mace and the bull, of course, is something that actually does appear, and I was able to add this just minutes ago, thanks to Axel sending me these images. So one thing to keep in mind with these early hieroglyphic inscriptions, we can be rather certain that they are inscriptions because they emphasize a consistent paleography. They are drawn in the same way. They are written as a series of lines and shapes that are similar, that conform to an actual written paleography, as opposed to being random drawings of a particular animal or a very particular object. But they are all closely associated with physical remains of the late pre-dynastic and proto-dynastic period. Now, this association of a bovid and a mace will appear in other of these early hieroglyphic inscriptions and annotated tableaux. So here at Jebel Chaoudi and the Wadi of the Horus Ka, both in the Western Desert, we see, so here the bovid head on a pole and the actual depiction of the ruler holding the mace, and a mace depending from a pole at the prow of the vessel, which itself appears to be labeled by the bull at the end. Now, you've all probably seen this, the El Hawi early hieroglyphic inscription. This was the first we discovered. There you can see it over my head in the photo. It's actually quite large. It certainly is the largest of these. I'll give you a sense of El Hawi now and show you a rough draft of a virtual reality tour of the site. We're trying to prepare these for all of the rock art sites so that we can convey a sense of the location, a sense of the landscape, the three-dimensionality of the rocks and the jebel surfaces on which the inscriptions are carved, and at the same time be able to zoom into high-definition photos, three-dimensional photos of the inscriptions themselves. So this is courtesy of Alberto Urquia and Lisa Brenner. Let's see if it will run. Eliza insisted on adding that opening. I did not. It is not possible, of course, to scan everything. We couldn't scan the little village that's right there next to El Hawi. So instead, using virtual reality, we can convey the essence of it and at the same time have an exact model of the jebel itself with the inscriptions. The track up leads along the shelf here, which is somewhat eroded since antiquity, and the inscriptions run across several panels, 4 major areas there. And now we're going to zoom in to the El Hawi early hieroglyphic inscription, and we're going to go right into the eyeball of one of the storks. So this is the El Hawi inscription, and it is actually one of the longest. You will note, as with the inscription at Sabaiya, perhaps only the mace there qualifies as hieroglyphic, but there is no other image other than the bull. There are no scenes. There are no flotillas. These are purely the early hieroglyphic signs themselves. Now, paleographically, they are virtually identical to corresponding signs in the Tomb Uj corpus from Abydos. And yet they are on a much larger scale. There, by comparison, labels from Tomb Uj and a dipinto from one of the vessels in Tomb Uj. So you can see that already at the dawn of what we might call these proto-hieroglyphs, the script is endlessly scalable. It can be miniaturized or monumentalized, and yet the signs remain the same. Paleographically, they are virtually identical. Well, the bovid head on a pole is not a hieroglyph that really seems to survive as such, this early hieroglyphic stage, but it's a reasonable suggestion, I think, that the bull represents some sort of power control, as certainly later it represents both the power of the king and, of course, is embodied in the bull's tail that becomes such a ubiquitous element in the royal regalia. Now, the organization of the birds the two storks and the bald ibis to the left forms a BAB arrangement, something that we find in ancient Egyptian iconography throughout. We even find it textually in the organization of solar hymns. So two, let's say, lesser elements with one central BAB design. And of course, this can be brought up many times. Here it appears over and over. The sun disk between the horizon hills, itself between the two lions of Aker. So I don't believe it's unreasonable to suggest that we also have some representation of the horizon here. And this is important because that central bird is the bald ibis. It's got a crest, of course, but another ibis got the name crested ibis. So the bald ibis was stuck with bald ibis. So that's the bird. And in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the bird that is the bald ibis in the hieroglyphic script, phonetically represents and that root has a meaning of luminosity or efficacy to it. So we may very well here have both a physical representation of the Akhet and a phonetic complement, if we might call it that, of the bird to represent the land of luminosity, the land of the horizon of the rising sun. If that's true, which I think it is, I hope it is, that would mean that the bald ibis here is the one of these early hieroglyphs for which you can make a reasonable phonetic suggestion and have it stick. Günter Dreyer and others have suggested phonetic readings for a number of the UJ labels, and as a number of people have pointed out, and as a imminently forthcoming publication by Andreas Stauder, I think, will demonstrate conclusively, most of the proposed readings rely on later orthographies or don't quite fit contextually what we see. And in fact, for all of these other signs, even though if this is indeed the saddle-bill stork, I believe it is, I'm not sure Andreas agrees, that would be the bird that writes ba. But does it represent that phonetically here in any way? I'm not certain that we can say that. Nevertheless, it does look like it might very well represent Akhet or horizon. And I will leave you with my speculation. I think it's at least a quasi-informed speculation that this is an equation of royal power, the bovid head on the pole, the royal totem, we might call it, with solar power in the horizon. Now, that would be a rather good Egyptian thing. And I love to point this out. It has absolutely no bearing on the other. But in Dürer's famous etching of the triumph of Maximilian, we get exactly the same kind of an expression. Not by the ancient Egyptians, by people vastly removed in time and space from the ancient Egyptians, but a very common concept of the ruler as representative, the ruler as hand of a deity or a divine power on earth. And of course, quod in caelis sol hoc in terra Caesar est, what the sun is in the sky, that is Caesar or the emperor on earth. So El-Hawi, in my opinion, represents a similar concept to this. Now let's move on to Vulture Rock. At Vulture Rock, we get early hieroglyphic signs, paleographically identical essentially with those of Tomb UJ. We get a stork and a bald ibis. Notice that the bald ibis has a serpent beneath its beak. We're going to see that again in the Western Desert inscriptions. The stork is the bird that more commonly seems to have the serpent beneath its beak. We even see it on objects like the Davis comb here. There's a serpent right in front of the rightmost of the storks at El-Hawi, And we'll see it at Jebel Chaudi in the Western Desert as well. So there's a certain interchangeability of elements within what look to be composite signs. And we'll see this a couple of times. Now, what does this mean? What is this interchangeability? The saddle-billed stork with the serpent beneath its beak not only can alternate with, okay, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I think the slideshow is trying to make me move on in spite of myself. The saddle-billed stork with the rearing serpent is followed by a giraffe, which then is followed by lines of animals, all by kind, with a dog bringing up the rear here and a star there. There's a certain syntax, in other words, to these images, whether we can read them phonetically, whether we can call them true writing or not, they involve a type of syntax. And the saddle-billed stork with the serpent rearing beneath its beak can be followed by another image. It can be part of a pair. At the scorpion tableau at Jebel Chaudi in the Western Desert, the saddle-billed stork with serpent is actually followed by a depiction of a man holding a mace, probably a ruler, with a bound prisoner in front. And of course, the saddle-billed stork with the serpent and the giraffe. So a certain interchangeability grouping appears in these. Now, is there some concept of triumph involved here in this image of the bird with the serpent beneath its beak? That's a possible sense that it may convey. What does it mean when the saddle-billed stork substitutes with the bald ibis? This is another question. At the Jebel al-Wuz site, we have a number of Nubian ibex heads augmented by feathers. These are not on poles. Most of the animal heads that we have, other than these, in fact, are depicted as mounted on poles. These appear individually augmented with the feather. They are not that similar to the examples from Tomb UJ. The farthest removed of these early hieroglyphic inscriptions are in the Wadi Rukba, rather far out to the east. And these are interesting because they show certain patterns. Wadi Rukba 3, there it is on this rock that slants a little bit and faces the caravan routes that are coming in through here. This image, this inscription is composed of two signs. The head of a Nubian ibex with a feather augmentation, followed by the sign of a throw stick. And we'll get into the throw stick a little bit later. But not only that, unusually here, in the other inscriptions, we don't have any images really accompanying them. They're just inscriptions. They're just proto-hieroglyphic inscriptions. They may be located at sites with earlier rock art, most of them are, but they don't themselves involve any boat flotillas. They don't involve the elephants. Sabaiya has a bull, that's it. Here, we actually get two depictions of the Nubian ibex. So it looks as though, in other words, what we have is the hieroglyph is a pars pro toto element of the animal. So we get two depictions, it's doubled here, two depictions of the Nubian ibex, of which the head on the pole as sign is an element. Now the throw stick, of course, is not uncommon in pre-dynastic and proto-dynastic imagery, and it is not infrequently associated with a falcon. The throw stick with the falcon, in fact, is something that appears in the scorpion tableau at Jebel Chaudi in the Western Desert, It survives in early hieroglyphs. It ultimately becomes the sign associated with the god Nemti. Held by Ka arms in early hieroglyphic script, it may in fact write aha, to fight, combat, later represented by the arms holding weapons. And inevitably, one thinks, well, at least inevitably I thought, of this inscription of Sabni, son of Pepinacht, admittedly late 6th dynasty, who repeats the word of Horus to his follower, and he is the throw stick of Horus in the foreign lands. So the throw stick, even as late as the Old Kingdom, is still a powerful image for the ancient Egyptians of the expression of some sort of authority in a foreign region. So what do we have at Wadi Rukba 3? Is it the projection of the power of whatever that Nubian ibex head represents? If the bull's head at El Thawi represents an official power, is this some other power? Is it another aspect of the same power? As of yet, we do not know. If we move to Wadi Rukba 26, we see another group of two signs with a following figure. Now, this is quite interesting because the image itself, the figure itself, and I checked this with Axel right before speaking, so I do not believe I'm misusing what she was saying. The figure is not traditionally, it's not a classic proto-dynastic human figure. It fits more with a late Naqada II tradition. Now, this might just be a rather archaic formed figure, or it may very well be that Wadi Rukba 26 could represent a particularly early example of the early hieroglyphic writing in the Eastern Desert. The two signs together appear to represent the head of an oryx, consistent with what we see in other early hieroglyphic depictions of the oryx. Below, the image of an arm holding a bow. Now, this is really quite remarkable because it gives us here the same thing that we find at that site just to the north, Wadi Rukba 3. We have a sign which is a part of the body, an arm holding a bow, next to an image that represents the total image. So once more, just as the Nubian ibex head is a pars pro toto sign accompanied by a depiction of the animal itself, so here we have the pars pro toto human arm holding bow represented then by this image of hunter or whatever the person may be holding the bow. This sign as such does not appear elsewhere, to my knowledge, in the early hieroglyphic corpus, the sign of the arm holding the bow. The bow is well attested, as you might imagine, and interestingly enough, it seems in early hieroglyphic script to be almost exclusively associated with Nubia or Nubians. So, we have a throw stick and the Nubian ibex head to the north in the Wadi Rukba, and we have the arm with bow and the oryx head to the south in the Wadi Rukba. They're trying to tell us something, and hopefully future discoveries may actually help us figure out what it is. I will not overly speculate now, except to say that there do seem to be very definite rules going on in these early hieroglyphic inscriptions. And one of the most important is that in the Eastern Desert, you do not annotate the inscription more than by providing a full depiction of some element of which one of the hieroglyphs represents a part. So the depictions, in other words, do not proliferate, and where they occur in the Wadi Rukba, they do not depart from the hieroglyphs themselves. They may augment the hieroglyphs as a depiction of the totality of what one of the signs represents in part, but they do not go beyond. Now, the bow also appears in the Western Desert in this horizontal position by itself, apparently labeling a bull, just as we had the mace labeling a bull at Sabaiya. So the more one starts to look at these, well, I might say one starts to imagine things, this is true, but the more one looks at these, the more you can see there are these consistent rules at play. There are these associations, one sign summoning up another. Very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, I want to look at the Western Desert material. Now, I'm not going to go over this in as great detail. All of this is published in Theban Desert Road Survey Volumes 1 and 2, along with a long article in OLA 205, if you want to look these up in greater detail. These are the early hieroglyphic inscriptions of the Theban Western Desert. Now, granted, I know these and I know those east of El Kab because those are areas in which I've worked. But considerable work has gone on and surveying, both by myself and others, in the region intervening between the Kenabend of the Nile and the eastern desert hinterland of El Kab, and to some extent to the south. And in those intervening areas, I do not know of any other early hieroglyphic inscriptions. So while these may not be the only concentrations, it is safe to say that those we've just examined in the eastern desert hinterland of El Kab, and those that we see here, essentially in the Kenabend region of the Western Desert, these represent two distinct, discrete, and unconnected foci of these early hieroglyphic annotations. And one of the most important things to take away from those in the Western Desert to the north is that they all but one do annotate scenes. They all but one do occur with large tableau, larger and smaller tableau. Only one in the Raina Desert, the far southwest region of this area in the Kenabend, only that one is only an early hieroglyphic sign. So whereas tableaux as such are absent in association with the early hieroglyphs in the El Kab Desert hinterland, they are ubiquitous, almost required in the Western Desert hinterland of ancient Thebes and Naqada. Now, of course, one of the biggest is the so-called scorpion tableau at Jebel Chaoudi. There's a photo just of the lower left portion, so you get some idea of it. I will show this here because this is a recent, this represents a collation of the tableau I did back in 2007, I believe. And I will be publishing this soon to replace the earlier version. But as you can see here, falcon signs, one augmented with a feather, storks, falcon on a pole, scorpion on a pole, saddle-bill stork with rearing serpent, bovid head on a pole, all occur along with, interspersed with images, as though they are annotating a scene. Another of the Western Desert examples, elephant on the mountain as a sign, annotates a boat bearing the standard of elephant on the mountain. Now, you might say, this sounds like the Wadi Rukba, and it does, because it sounds like we have a sign which is an element of the larger image. It is a pars pro toto representation of the boat with elephant on the mountain. And yes, it is, but you'll notice there's a second vessel made at the same time that accompanies it. So as small a tableau it is a two-boat flotilla. And in the syncopation that we find in some of the pre-dynastic rock art sites, two boats can make a flotilla. Feather augmentations, this ability to make a composite sign, is present in both the Eastern Desert examples and the Western Desert examples. In the Western Desert, in the Wadi Magar, we see a large tableau in which the saddle-bill stork with serpent that we might expect, followed by a giraffe and a whole line of animals. This image is being played with, but the saddle-bill stork is replaced by what appears to be a heron, followed not by the giraffe, not by the ruler with the prisoner, as we saw in the scorpion tableau, but here followed by a crocodile, with then lines of birds going in order. So we have some syntax involved here, but it still is a hieroglyphic annotation with a sort of tableau accompanying it. A number of early hieroglyphic annotations appear in the Wadi Magar in a much larger scene. If I take away the palimpsest, you can see here this forest of crocodiles on poles that appear here at least to be elements of some annotation to the scene. And interestingly enough, the closest parallel to those is on this painted bowl from, as you can see here, the A group cemetery at Khustul. There are, in fact, a number of excellent, what we might call lower Nubian parallels to much of the imagery that we see here. So the falcon in the boat and the falcon in the boat, the crocodile standards, etc. If we look at the great Ka'a tableau in the Western Desert, we'll see a number of annotations throughout, and we'll also notice a number of really close parallels with Nubian material. So this well-known incense burner from Khustul has striking parallels to the vessels and the other material in this Ka'a tableau. In the Wadi of the Horus Ka'a, the same wadi in which that big tableau is located, there is also an annotation of what formerly were two sandals, with then the elephant apparently labeling it there. Now, this is interesting because it may very well give us yet another indication of what this might mean. What does that mean? There was an elephant that had sandals, or there's a sandal that has an elephant on it. The best parallel, and remember, many of our parallels are not going to come from text. This is the dawn of writing as we know it. Many of the parallels are going to come from objects. There is an object that I think is amazingly informative for this. This is British Museum label EA 55586. On one side, we see Den, the first occasion of smiting the East or smiting the Easterners. And on the other side, pair of sandals. Was it tied to a pair of Den's sandals? That's quite possible. But notice the association of victorious ruler and sandals, because we actually have this in an epithet of Khasehemui, who is the beneficial souls against the foreign lands. This is the ruler Pet Khasut trampling the foreigners. So, one more bit of evidence, along with those labeled First Dynasty augmentations to earlier flotilla, another little bit of evidence perhaps that what we're seeing here doesn't necessarily need to be read in a purely or even primarily phonetic way, but that some royal power evidenced by the elephant. Remember those elephants in the hinterland of El Kab, more or less mirroring where we found those flotilla scenes and where we find the Serex of Ka'a. This elephant labeling the sandals here appears to be, again, a representation of royal power on the Jebel. His sandals are literally, even though it's a vertical surface, he's literally graphically trampling the foreign lands. And I will point out, of all of the Western Desert examples, only the Cave of the Pegs and Rayina has just the bald ibis with rearing serpent. So, in the south, annotations without scenes. In the north, scenes with annotations. Now, this is preliminary and not everything is in there, but this will appear shortly. Paleographic charts of the early hieroglyphic inscriptions in the Theban Western Desert and in the desert hinterland of El Kab, and they are actually remarkably similar. I won't go into all of this, but let me just conclude with a few of the basic commonalities. What do we have here? It's actually a rather limited corpus. Birds, saddle-bill stork, bald ibis, falcon, rather common. We seem to have a substitution of the saddle-bill stork by a heron in that one example. Animal head standards and animal heads. These are kind of peppered throughout the El Kab region, but we really only have the one in the Theban Western Desert. So that seems to be a little bit of a regional difference. We have a number of animals of elite authority, and that might very well include all those heads on poles, for all we know. The bull's head at El Hawi has an internal line. The same line is apparent in the Dipinti with the bull's head on the pole from Tum-Yu-J. And as Stan Hendricks pointed out, that internal line that we also find in elephants and other animals is apparently a line for a facial vein, literally a line of power, indicating that that image of an animal of power really is a powerful example of that image of power. Weapons are not ubiquitous, but they are there. They're present in the throw stick, they're present in the bow, they're present in the mace. There are augmentations with feathers. There are groupings of signs with others, like a animal head on a pole with a weapon. There is some syntax involved, bird with following element that can be played with. We can alternate stork and serpent with bald ibis and serpent. I do not believe that the early hieroglyphic inscriptions from the Eastern and Western Desert support a view that the different corpora of signs from Tum-Yu-J, the signs that we find in the labels as opposed to the signs that we find in the Dipinti, which do seem to not to overlap really very much in the Tum-Yu-J corpus. We do seem to see an overlapping of those, and we see other signs that don't appear in any. So whether this represents regional versions, as has been suggested, I'm not certain, but I don't think necessarily that we should see well-developed different parallel sign lists based on what we see in the desert material. Phonetic values, I do not believe we can see it all, and the only one I feel comfortable proposing and proposing over and over again is the bold ibis as ah, at least in the El Hawi example. But would it have to be ah everywhere else? I don't think we can say, but the limited number of images and the stress on animals of power, totemic images on poles, weapons, this appears to stress a control and an expression of power and control that expresses it perhaps somewhat in a more nuanced way, but replaces those early flotillas of ritual authority, replaces those earlier elephants of elite power that we find in the desert hinterland of El Kab. The ancient Egyptians are most definitely telling us something, but whether they are doing it in a phonetic manner, other than in the El Hawi inscription, I don't believe we can say. And in conclusion, what does it mean that we all but once have tableau with the hieroglyphic inscriptions in the north and no tableau in the south? I'm really not certain what this means. A forthcoming publication by Axel Bremont and Dorian van Hule look at a series of iconographic elements that associate southern Upper Egypt and lower Nubia and show a sort of iconographic continuum during the late pre-dynastic and the proto-dynastic period. One of the important elements is this boat with a high prow, slightly lower stern, sometimes even incurving, as we find here at Sheikh Othman. This elite or ritual vessel, perhaps both are interchangeable terms appropriate to this. This is common in southern Upper Egypt and in lower Nubia. And it's as far north as the El Kab area with the boats at Sheikh Othman here. This appears to represent a type of border area, an interface region between what we might call the Naqada home territory, maybe Heracleopolis and north, and the A group home territory south of the First Cataract. If this is true, what does it mean that the early hieroglyphs are without iconographic assistance in the far south? One suggestion is that writing in the Naqada home territory is an augmentation of imagery, adding nuance, adding some specificity for people who know both the script and the iconography. But in this area of an interface and interchange of shared iconography between what we might call an early A group kingdom in the south and the nascent Dynasty Zero in the north, writing then could be a barrier. Writing could be a way of splitting off those who know the script from those who do not. It is a question. And I will leave you all with that, just stressing the great importance of the desert roads. And that is exactly how we found all of these, following the desert roads out into the east and to the west. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, John, for this demonstration. So we will maybe wait until the end of the prayer to have some questions. Some of you wants to ask a question to John.
Thank you very much for this. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Got it again? Firstly, thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. And I like to move with you from the eastern and the western desert to Cairo Museum, the Egyptian Museum. Actually, I have two questions. The first one about the through stick and the early forensic science. About the through sticks, what we have in Cairo Museum, what mean the Libyan pallets or scorpion pallet, we have also early phonetic signs, the through stick. What does this mean here, please?
What I think we can probably say about the throw stick is that it must, like the other weapons, represent some sort of projection of authority, whether that merely is hunting control of the region or some more, let's say, state authority or state control. The epithet as late as the 6th dynasty of someone as the throw stick of Horus, and the fact that we have a throw stick with a falcon in the scorpion tableau, I think is probably more than just coincidence. So that what we have in these early hieroglyphic inscriptions, I believe, is a statement of the control of some power. I often myself fall into the habit of just saying royal authority. This is almost certainly pre-royal as we might even conceive of it. But the power of a state, even the power of the bureaucrats who are inventing that writing, that the throw stick is literally a depiction of the projection, really the throwing of that power out into these areas. One of the things we see in a lot of the pre-dynastic rock art is a blending of Nilotic and desert imagery that can give us a type of Niloticization of the desert, as I've called it, an extension, in other words, an extension of the ritual nautical Nilotic world out into the desert, to Niloticize that, to make the outside part of the inside, to internalize those areas. And I believe the throw stick there probably also represents that, just represents the forceful extension of that power, whereas the flotillas and other ways might represent other means of incorporation of the region.
Another one, I like to understand the vessels of the unusual vessels, which you have appraised arms in Cairo Museum or a jar with legs. Can we be also early phonetic signs for Ka and Imit, or you don't accept that?
I mean, no, absolutely. One could absolutely suggest these things. And I think this is what we're seeing here, is we're seeing an interplay of earlier imagery earlier iconography with a nascent script, at least some of which is going to become phonetic, some of which, I'm going to go back to my Achbird, I love my Achbird, some of which might also be phonetic early on, so that we're in an area of transition where we can represent these things as signs, they can be represented as two-dimensional images, they can be represented in a three-dimensional way, and that in the early dynastic period, we're in a period of flux where all of these things are interrelated, and we find them, I believe, at least from my knowledge, more frequently, we find these playful, the walking pots, etc., more frequently in this earlier period than later. So I think we're at a phase of experimentation of how in 2 and 3 dimensions to bring together functionality and iconography. And remember, all of these are carved on the desert surface and they presuppose a viewer. So in all of these, when I talked about signs and tableau, there are 2 other elements involved: the landscape location and the fact that somebody's viewing them, that there is a viewer, there's an audience for all of these.
Thank you so much, Professor Bernal, for the joyous journey to the land of the blueprint. Egypt is quintessential hieroglyphic capital. 2 questions connected, and that is, it seems that you are discovering or developing a way or criteria whereby you can determine the hieroglyphicness, or what I might call the hieroglyphicity of a carving. And you have also mentioned the synecdoche, the totem proporta. I wonder if that's one of the criteria. And again, thank you for the monumental mental discovery.
You're very nice. Thank you very much. Well, I was afraid someone might ask that. Yes, I believe in those examples, the fact that we do have the synecdoche, the fact that we do have the pars pro toto, to my mind makes relatively clear what is a depiction and what is let's say, a textual representation or manifestation. Now, in some of these, one could argue, so I admit to making some judgment calls here. There is another elephant that I did not show and I toyed with, and I'm probably going to put it in the book anyway, from another site in the Wadi Rukba that may cross the line. It is an augmentation to an earlier vessel. So there are a couple of places where I've tried to err on, I'm not sure, I don't think I want to incorporate that. But remember, for all of these, well, not for all of these, but for some, one could argue, say, the bull and the mace at Sabaiya. But generally speaking, the absence of tableau make the inscriptions in the Al-Qab Eastern Desert relatively clear. The presence of the tableau in the Western Desert of Naqada tends to make the hieroglyphic annotations stick out somewhat because they look stuck on, added in, pushed into the visual narrative. So I think the absence of any visual narrative in the South and the fact of their somewhat odd placement augmenting the visual narrative in the North makes me relatively confident about the hieroglyphicity of the signs I've included. But there may be more, and I definitely hope we do find more. The fact that those 2 areas don't seem to be connected, part of that, of course, is a result of the desert road networks. These are not being carved out in the middle of nowhere. They're being carved on roads. At all these sites, if there's good stone over there and there's bad stone here, but the road is here, they'll carve them on the bad stone rather than go over there to carve them on the good stone. So they are all being carved with the intent of being seen and of communicating with people. So some of the separation there is due to the lack of really wonderful surfaces with associated roads intervening, but there are some, we have checked some, and they don't seem to be there. See, I'm trying to get in extra information like this. I'm cheating. I'm finishing kind of on time, and then I'm going on and on. But
Thank you, Doctor, for this interesting presentation. My question is, are these explanations for the hieroglyphic signs are only speculations and personal opinion, or there are acceptance between other Egyptologists about the explanations of this hieroglyphic signs?
I'm afraid I can't answer that. I don't believe there's speculation. I try to support everything I say in the publications. I even put in a few footnotes up here. I hope you'll excuse me for that. I have a kind of a love of footnotes. I've been told that, well, I've been told a couple of things that I use text as glue for the footnotes. I kind of do that sometimes, I suppose. I believe it is as well founded as we can be in the kind of murky, inevitably somewhat shadowy era of proto-writing. As far as what everyone else thinks about it, I don't know. You're going to have to ask everybody else.
Hi, quick question. Are you able to date these depictions relatively to each other and also an absolute dating? And if yes, which techniques do you use?
No absolute dating for these because they are all relatively recent enough, let's say second half of the 4th millennium BCE and later, that stylistic iconographic criteria will give us a much more accurate date than any other, let's say, scientific dating methods. In terms of the iconography of the vessels, of the animals, etc., that is already reasonably well established and is being ever increasingly refined. And for much of that, of course, I owe my colleagues Axel Bremont and Dorian van Hule. Amongst others.
Thank you for the lecture. I have a question. It might be a little bit far away from your research, but I was watching Joe Rogan Experience. Everyone knows that Joe Rogan. He wasn't one of those archaeologists. They were saying at the Grand Canyon there is some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Do you believe that there's something?
No, I would say that is
like a conspiracy theory?
that is a thing about which people love to speculate. Many people have speculated. Some of you may know an infamous book from the late 70s, I believe it is, called America BC. According to that volume, if you had gone to North America in the several centuries BCE to CE, you would have been bumping into almost everybody except Native Americans. There would have been Celtiberians and Egyptians, etc. This is all this is all just wild speculation and a desire to see the ancient Egyptians traveling. It's almost certainly an outcome of the sort of hyper diffusionism that was so popular, let's say in anthropology and other fields in Victorian period. Not to belittle the Victorian period. Sometimes diffusionism is correct, but no, unfortunately, I do not believe there is any evidence that the ancient Egyptians were in Arizona. Unfortunately, I mean that unfortunately, but
Maybe because this is a good chance to understand what we have. We have also in Cairo Museum a very interesting thing, the statue of God Min. The depiction of elephant also on the mountains, in these statues, and also the other depiction. What does this mean? Because the divine statues and we have such as this.
that is an excellent, that's an excellent question. I showed the oryx head from one of the Coptos colossi. Those images figure, of course, in Dreyer's original monumental publication of the labels from UJ. How do we read those? Do we read them? I would say on the basis of what we see in these early hieroglyphic inscriptions in the Eastern and Western Desert, that they probably represent not proto kings, that they don't represent, let's say, dynasties, 00 rulers or something like that, but they are somehow specific representations of particular manifestations of power. Certain rulers might have preferred one over the other, let's say, but I don't believe that looking for phonetic readings for those signs really works. You know, the elephant on the mountain has been suggested to be able to be read as Ab, elephant, Jew, mountain, and you've got Abju, you've got Abydos, except the sign never seems to have anything to do with Abydos. It's out at Naqada, west of Naqada. It's at other places. So, you know, is some kind of rebus at work? Are there phonetic elements? Might these things have both phonetic and non-phonetic meanings? We need more of them. I have to say that over time, I have become unenamored of phonetic readings of these. I'm going to stick to that Achbert as Achet and Al-Khawi. But other than that, yes, we have phonetic readings that we can propose, but I don't think we have the evidence as of yet to say what they mean. So in my opinion, what's on the Coptos Colossus is it's the god Min. It's a deity who at least later is very much associated with the desert and the extension of royal power and control and the passing on of royal power through the generations. So to supercharge that colossal for the time image with these various stamps, literally tattoos of these images of power is probably what we're seeing. And I will mention one more time, I've talked about this elsewhere, terms for rock surface and the human skin can overlap. The Egyptians can refer to graffiti making and tattooing in similar ways. A tattoo is a carving on the skin. The skin of the rock, according to Horwell Ray at Sinai, can blister in the summer heat. So using graffiti type signs on the skin, on the leg of men, to me, just expresses multiple aspects of the power of that divinity. But much more work needs to be done on that.
If I may take you back to the synecdoche as a hieroglyphizing tool, I suppose it goes the other way around as well. So it could be totem pro parte. If you may cite an example beyond the infamous, the reputable pharaoh examples, the locus classicus, the classic example.
Oh, I'm not sure in the early hieroglyphic inscriptions, I'm going to have to think about that as to whether we actually have that. But definitely the pars pro toto functions, definitely there are some syntactic arrangements when you get multiple signs together. So that's one of the interesting features, is that with the salable stork and rearing serpent in front, followed by a second sign or image, we get what you might call syntactic rules even before the script may be fully phonetic. In other words, the language spoken and the rules of early Egyptian may be influencing already the arrangements of signs, even before those signs themselves have phonetic characteristics. There's a imminently forthcoming publication of the UJ labels by Andreas Stauder, and also by Stauder and others, of that amazing little copper ewer in Basel that I just mentioned in passing. You will be amazed by this object that I believe will put the study of the UJ labels on an even firmer footing.
Thank you very much, John Darnell, for this brilliant lecture and for all your answer to those questions. And I invite all the people to go to the buffet for a few ordering with us in honor of our speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.